We're live now.
Friends, uh, welcome once again to the Asha and Ganga Jamni program. Uh, Today, we are going to start with our new series, Sources of Medieval Indian History. Through this series, we intend to have lectures by eminent historians dealing with a select few primary chronicles, both Persian and non-Persian. Sources which deal with early medieval, from Ghaznavi to Delhi Sultanate, and then on to the Mughals. We have tried to focus on those sources which throw some light on the developing common Indian society and culture. Remember that our best defense against circulation of myths in the name of history is reliance on the primary sources of the period under consideration. All those who study history know that history, simply put, is a study of the past based on written sources and accounts. According to E.H. Carr, it is the study of historical facts. And historical facts are gleaned from the writings which are primary, close in time and space. For the study of medieval period in India, our primary sources comprise of texts, chronicles, travelogues, etc., written in Persian or in vernacular languages like Rajasthani, Gujarati, Hindavi, Marathi, and other such languages. They are also in the form of chronicles, letters, and travelogues written in Dutch, French, and Portuguese. Amongst the non-written primary sources, we have the miniature paintings and the material remains, etc. In this series, we will try to deal with the primary written sources, most of which are in Persian. We would also take up some non-Persian sources as well as we proceed. During the course of this series, we hope to have professors like Irfan Habib Saab, Harbans Mukhia ji, Shiri Muswi, Azizuddin Hussain, Supriya Gandhi, Audrey Trushke, Don Sheffield, Purushottam Agarwal, Najaf Haider, and many, many more. Today, we start with the first lecture of the series, which is on Ghaznavite sources on Indian history and what they tell us about India during the 10th and the 7th centuries. But before we start with that, let us deal with a basic question. Although I know that Professor, the speaker of the day would in fact be dilating on that aspect, but just a brief introduction. A question which comes to our mind, everyone's mind, is who was Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni? I would also try to introduce you to the fact that whether his period was only a period of strife or was there any attempt made towards understanding each other. Mahmud is taken to be basically a Butt Khan, first of the most hated quadruplet. That is Mahmud himself, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, Babur, and Aurangzeb. Muhammad Habib's book, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, tries to show that Sultan Mahmud, contrary to the popular image which he has acquired in India, he invaded India not for the wealth, not for conquest as a Muslim conqueror, not to circulate Islam in India, but to gain wealth. In fact, Muhammad Habib goes on to show that temples were repositories of wealth. He took, Hindus from India during his campaigns. While he returned, he took many of the Hindus back with him to Ghazni. They were settled in Ghazni. They were never converted. In fact, we have reports in the Ghaznawite sources themselves that temples were allowed to be built at Ghazni. Tilak, who was the commander of Masood, was a Hindu of Indian origin. He was leading the forces of the Ghaznavites during the period of Sultan Masood, who was the successor of Mahmud. We have a number of evidences provided by Professor Muhammad Habib in his famous book Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, in which he shows that during the period of Sultan Masood, one of the theologians of that area, who was living in a very dire condition, economic conditions, the Sultan sent him camel loads of wealth. The theologian was hesitant to take it. But the Sultan, through his agents, tried to explain that this was the wealth which his father had gained through the ghazwas, the jihads, which he had carried on in India. Muhammad Habib goes on to show through the sources that this theologian refused to take any penny from this wealth. He did not believe that this was a legally acquired wealth at all. In fact, there are other evidences which Muhammad Habib goes on to show that the contemporaries of Sultan Mahmud never thought him to be a Ghazi, never thought him that he was campaigning in India as a jihad. It was basically a campaign for the wealth and nothing else. And that is why one of the reasons that there is a hikayat in Firdausi's Shahnama, where according to this hikayat, when the Sultan died, people saw that when his bier was being taken to be buried, his eyes were rotating all around, looking for the wealth which he had gained. Before I hand over this session to my friend and senior colleague, Professor Jabir Raza, I would like to discuss with you a very important coin, silver coin, which was struck in 419 Hijri, that is 1028 AD at Lahore, which at that time was known as Mahmudpur. It is interesting that the name Mahmudpur was given to this, and this name occurs on the coin itself. On this coin, we find in Arabic, Bismillah, Zareba, Haza, Al Dirham, Mahmudpur. That in the name of God, this coin was struck at Mahmudpur, and the date which is given along with that is 490. That is Hijri. Now, in the center, we have a text which is also very interesting. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, Yaminud Dawla wa Aminul Millat Mahmud. Muhammad is the messenger, protector of the state, and the custodian of the community, who is Mahmud. And then on this side, there is also occurs the name of the Khalifa of the age, Al-Qadir Billah, the Abbasid Khalifa who was sitting at Baghdad. But more interesting that this is in fact one of the first, you can say, the Islamic currency which was issued in India, this particular coin. Now, more important is the fact that on the reverse side, you have an inscription which is in the Sanskrit language, which is written in the Sharda script, a script which was used in that region before Gurmukhi and Kashmiri scripts came into existence. The text, which is written in the Sharda script and in the Sanskrit language, declares that this particular coin is a tanka, a dirham in Arabic. Again, the same type of information that it was struck at Mahmudpur. And the in Sanskrit, what is written is that God is the invisible one. Avyaktam ekam, the Sanskrit of there is no God but Allah. Muhammada avatara, in place of Muhammad as the prophet, here the coin uses the term avatar for the prophet, that Muhammad is the avatar. And apart from that, it also claims that the Nirpati, the king of the place, is Mahmuda, Sultan Mahmud. Now, this is the first time that what we are observing is the fact that the name of the Sultan, the kalma rendered in the local the language in Sanskrit, written in Sharda script, where the term prophet is being translated into the term avatar. Now, I have taken this information from a very interesting book which is written by Barry Flood, and I hope that as we proceed during the course of these lecture series, we would have Barry Flood as one of the speakers with us, probably sometime in or in February. Now, with these opening remarks, I would now come to the fact that today we are going to have Professor Sayyid Jabir Raza, who would be telling us about the sources of the Ghaznavite period. Now, the Ghaznavites, as all of you know, is a dynasty which was ruling over an area which is known as Ghazni. Sultan Mahmud was one of the first of these Ghaznavite rulers who attacked India a number of times. He died in 1030. He was succeeded by Masood I, who again ruled for around 10 years, 130 to 40. He was subsequently succeeded by other rulers. There are around 18 kings of this dynasty. And the details of these dynasties can be found in a very important book which was written by C.E. Bosworth, The Ghaznavites. It was ultimately in 1151 AD that the last of the Ghaznavite rulers, Bahram Shah, was defeated by Alauddin Jahasos. And from that 1151 onwards, the Ghaznavites were then replaced by the Ghurids. Professor Jabir Raza, Sayyid Jabir Raza, is a scholar of the Ghaznavite history. In fact, after Bosworth, he is one of the scholars who is dealing with the Ghaznavites as far as the Indian universities is concerned. Dr. Raza did his PhD on Punjab and Sindh under the Ghaznavites, 11th and 12th centuries. His MPhil, in fact, was also on the life and conditions of Punjab of the same period. He has written extensively on various aspects pertaining to this period, including a very well-researched paper on the concept of Ikhta. All the students who join this lecture, I would recommend to them that please go through the article which Professor Raza has written on the Ikhta system, which prevailed during the Sultanate period in India. Dr. Raza has been the first Charles Wallace Fellow from Aligarh to SWAS. He was also visiting fellow at Paris, Maison des Sciences de la Home. And both these things he accomplished in 1996. He was also associated with the ICHR project on Dictionary of Social, Economic, and Administrative Terms in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu inscriptions, which is being edited by Professor Irfan Habib, who is Professor Emeritus at Aligarh. He is one of the founding members of the association which is holding this program, ASHA. He is in fact the vice president at the moment of the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology. Welcome, Professor Syed Jabir Raza, to this show. Before I actually request you to deal with the topic on Ghaznavite sources for India, let me remind our listeners that incidentally, it was only 4 days back that 1049th birth anniversary of Sultan Mahmud went by. In fact, it was on 2nd November 971 AD that Sultan Mahmud was born. Over to you, Professor Raza.
Well, thank you, Nadeem. I'm just overlapping your introduction that who were the Ghaznavites? Actually, why this term Ghaznavite was used for this dynasty? Actually, it was from their nisba from the town Ghazni. So it was the connection with the Ghazni which led the modern scholars to call this dynasty, whole dynasty, as the Ghaznavid dynasty. Actually, it was Al-Taghin, who was the slave Turkish commander of Samanid, Ahmad bin Ismail, who established his rule in this region. When Abdul Malik died, during the time of Abdul Malik, he was appointed as the governor of Khurasan. But when Abdul Malik died, he became the independent ruler or independent chief of this region. And during the time of his brother, after the death of Abdul Malik, in course of the succession, he supported the minor child of Abdul Malik. But the soldiers made his brother Mansur as the chief, as the ruler of the Samanid dynasty. So knowing very well that he's supporting the wrong side, he behaving like a rebellious and in course and disturbing the rule of Mansur. So in course of time, Mansur in 1961 made him the independent chief of that region. And he ruled that region, the area of Khurasan, as well as he conquered the Bust and made the Ghazni as his original place in 1963. So he started actually, he was the founder member of the Ghaznavid dynasty actually. But in course of time, his son and his other slaves member, Bilqa Taghin and Piri Taghin and his son Ishaq were proved not eligible. And by 1975, Sabuk Taghin, who was also the slave of Al-Taghin, Turkish slave of Al-Taghin, and who has been in the service of the Samanid ruler, hold the region of this Kabul, Ghazni, Bust, and Khurasan. And he established Ghazni as a capital. He made Ghazni as a capital. And after him, his son, who was very famous, who became very famous, Mahmud, was suffixed with the terminology as Mahmud Ghaznavi. So this is the nisba of their town, which led the scholars to call the dynasty as Ghaznavids, like that of the Ghurids, with their nisbah with the Ghur. Number one. And the secondly, how the modern scholars became attracted to this dynasty. So in 1930, by 1930, the modern scholars have been showing their interest in the history of the Ghaznavids. And it was from Aligarh. It was Professor Muhammad Habib who introduced the Ghaznavid rule, especially the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, in his monograph entitled Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, published in 1927, attracted the attention of the other scholars towards the Ghaznavid dynasty. This book led Muhammad Nazim for in-depth study, again in the monograph on the life and times of Mahmud of Ghazna, and his book is published from Cambridge in 1931. Then, after 3 decades gap, C. Bosworth came to the surface. He came with his very, very pioneer work on the Ghaznavids, their empire in Afghanistan and Iran, and Eastern Iran, dealing with Sultan Mahmud's military conquests in Central Asia and India, but also including the campaign and times of Sultan Masood, his son and successor, in this work. And that is why this work deals with from the 994 to 1040, 1040, during the time, till the time of Sultan Masood. And after that, he came up with the second work in 1977, and he named his work The Later Ghaznavids, A Splendor and Decay. In this work, in first work, Bosworth deals and concentrated only in Central Asian and Iranian parts of their rule, Sultan Masood's rule. But in this work, Bosworth deals the whole dynasty, whole empire of the Ghaznavids, because, as you have said, by the time of Bahram Shah, and even before the time, during the time of Sultan Masood, the Ghaz incursions sunk in the Central Asian portion of the Ghaznavid dynasty. So they, in course of time, by the time of Bahram Shah and his son Khusro Shah, they shifted from Ghazni to Lahore. And this time, by the force of the incursion by the Ghurids, by the rise of the Ghurids from their neighborhood. So we find these 3 scholars, 3 modern scholars, deal in depth with the Ghaznavids. Muhammad Habib introduced the Ghaznavids, and Muhammad Nazim, having in his monograph, deals with the campaigns as well as the administrative system established by the Sultan Mahmud only. But Bosworth expanded it to the whole dynasty till the arrival of the Muizzuddin of Ghor. So in these, for completion of these, they have to depend upon the different sources. And sources, as you have said, the written accounts, contemporary as well as non-contemporary. In non-contemporary comes both the near contemporary as well as the later. So these sources were used for this purpose. But it was not by Muhammad Nazim. It was the Central Asian scholar Barthold, who in his work Turkestan down to the Mongol invasion, in his bibliographical introduction, deals with the 4 authorities of the Ghaznavid time. It was the Utbi, Bayhaqi, Gardezi, and others. So in 1928, Barthold come up with this work, and in his introduction introduced these Ghaznavid sources. And after that, Muhammad Nazim in 1931 dealt in depth with the other sources of the Ghaznavid period. He utilized not only the contemporary, rather non-contemporary sources in depth. And he also surveyed the work which was very much contemporary to the Ghaznavid period, but now lost. And we have only references in citations of other works. So this is the attempt, the achievement of Muhammad Nazim regarding the sources of the Ghaznavids, because he surveyed all the extant work as well as the lost work. Bosworth analyzed in the same way, the sources which Nazim utilized earlier. In one of his articles, the early sources for the early four Ghaznavids, the sources for the early four Ghaznavids, he deals with the same, the Utbi, Bairuni, Gardezi, and Bayhaqi. In his work again, he analyzed these sources, and his second work, he analyzed much of the poetic works, the poetic genre of the time, which was the only source for the later Ghaznavids. So he not only analyzed in a different way to all these known sources, but also add 2 or 3 new sources. So one of the Ibn Baba's work is very important, which is in Arabic again, and he utilized that work and appended the work in his book. So, but all these work here, I again repeat all these work utilized by the modern scholars of the Ghaznavid history in a new approach. New approach meaning by I have to look after, I have to survey or scrutinize this work from the point of view of India. So what about these sources told about the India? Because Muhammad Nazim, Bosworth, Barthold all deals these sources in general, not particular from the Indian point of view. Well, it is a coincidence, but in chronological sequence, our sources have been classified into 3 main languages: Arabic, Persian, and of course the Indian language, Sanskrit. From the very early works, we find 2 authors, Utbi and Al-Biruni, who left his work in Arabic. Utbi in his Kitab al-Yamini, and Al-Biruni is in his Tahqiq Mal al-Hind, better known as Kitab al-Hind, again wrote in Arabic, mentions some references related with the Ghaznavids, rulers, and their society and culture. Both these early scholars have their own take, have their own explanation regarding the writing of this book in Arabic. Al-Biruni was a scholar, a scientist, not a historian. He was a scholar. He was a Khwarezmian scholar, and he reached Ghazni in 1019 and 1818, and from there he reached India in 1019 and lived here mostly in Lahore, in Punjab area, and in Multan, and learned Sanskrit. And by 1030 he left a book known as Tahqiq Mal al-Hind in Arabic. He was a versatile and prolific writer. he not only left this one book, he left so many, a number of books. And the Qanun-e-Masudi is very magnum opus, which deals with the astronomy of the time, and the Kitabul Jamahir deals with the precious stones of the time, and Kitabul Tafhim deals with the science of the time, and Kitabul Sayyadana deals with the medicine of the time. And in all these works, we find the contributions of Indians side by side by Al-Biruni. Since he was well versed in Sanskrit, he learned Sanskrit in India, and he left his work, all his work in Arabic. So Al-Biruni considered Arabic a language of learned class, like that of Sanskrit in India. And that is why he wrote all his work in Arabic, except that of Kitabul Tafhim, Tanjim, which he wrote in both the language, Arabic as well as in Persian. So here is the explanation that since Arabic is the lingua franca of the Muslim world, and Arabic is the language of the higher educated class, learned class, and that is why Al-Biruni used to write in Arabic. Even in his book Tahqiq Mal al-Hind, in one place, Al-Biruni indirectly suggested Sultan Mahmud to make Arabic his state language. So it was his explanation to write his book in Arabic. And Utbi, who was a panegyric of Sultan Mahmud, who was the Wazir of Secretary of Sultan Mahmud, he extended his own explanation that he was asked by Prince Muhammad to compile a book of his father Mahmud's Indian as well as Central Asian campaigns to popularize him, to propagate his conquests in the Arab world. Although he failed in this motive because his work not crossed the boundary of Iraq or Iran, not reached even in Egypt or other Syria and other part of the world. But his explanation in in Arabic is that. So in these two Arabic works, Utbi is attached with the court, while Al-Biruni is a free man, and even he don't like much Sultan Mahmud, except that Sultan Mahmud patronized him in learning and studying Sanskrit in India and living in India, that's all. But he never attracted with the military campaigns or exploits led by Sultan Mahmud. But Utbi highlighted the military and religious activities of Sultan Mahmud in India as well as in Central Asia. Here we find a contrast that when Sultan Mahmud led campaign in Central Asia, Utbi termed it a conflict between the two sovereigns. But when Sultan Mahmud led expedition in India, Utbi termed it a conflict between the followers of two different religions. So here, Utbi's religiosity is very much apparent in his work, but in early part of his work. And especially when he deals with the neighbor Hindu Shahia rulers and Sultan Mahmud's conflict with the Hindu Shahia rulers, he was harsh. He here and there called the India as Darul Ghazw. It is again the very much different because the author of Adabul Harb wa Shuja called this place as Darul Harb, the place of battle, the enemy's country. But Utbi called it as Darul Ghazw, the place of Gaza. So again, touching the religious aspects of his expeditions, Sultan Mahmud's expeditions. So in all the expeditions against the Hindu Shahya rulers, he was very much sided with Sultan Mahmud with religious aspects, but never used the term jihad. Never used the term jihad. But after the defeat of Hindu Shahya ruler at Nandana, when he mentions the expeditions of Sultan Mahmud against Thaneshar, he is very much different. Here is a contrast. Al-Biruni mentioned Thaneshar as a religious place of India, and in so many words said about the Chakraswamin idols, which is of bronze, made of bronze, of Thaneshar. And he said that Sultan Mahmud broke this idol and carried to Ghazni. But here Utbi's take is very much different. Utbi has not deals in the Thaneshar expedition in terms of religion. He said that Sultan Mahmud's motive to attack Thaneshar was to acquire the military, the highest breed of the war elephants, which is called the Salmani breed. So it was the Indian war machine elephant which attracted the attention of Sultan Mahmud to attack the Thaneshar. And Utbi's attentions was very much different here in comparison to that of the scientist Al-Biruni. And it seemed that although he was a secretary, but it seems that he never accompanied Sultan Mahmud in his Indian expedition. That is why he lacks geography and topography of Indian region. And sometimes he omits the expedition of Sultan Mahmud, like that of the expedition of Kashmir, which was done during his lifetime. He concluded his work in 1020 AD, because by that time, by the court intrigue, he was disgraced from the Ghaznavid court by Sultan Mahmud. So his last mention of Indian expedition is the Kannauj expedition. It's a very, very long expedition in the deep Gangetic regions. In this expedition, Sultan Mahmud crossed all the regions, all the 5 rivers of Punjab, and then Jamuna and Ganga, which Utbi records. And from the side of the Jammu areas, he crossed the river Ganga in Mathura region, and then he reached Baran, Bulandshahr, modern Bulandshahr, and then knocked the door of Mathura. Here again, at the very important information Utbi is recorded. Being a secretary, Utbi had a letter of Sultan Mahmud in his hand, in which Sultan Mahmud glorified and praised the architectural beauty and constructional skill of the Indians by making this temple at Mathura. So Utbi records in detail the letter which was sent by Sultan Mahmud. It is called as Safarnama, but in my opinion, it was the Fatahnama, which Sultan Mahmud sent from Mathura to Ghazni for his nobles. So he recorded all these things, and he praised the architectural skills of India and said that it was made by any man in 200 years. So was the splendor, monuments, edifice of Mathura's temple. But he adds in these records that Sultan ordered to fire this temple and level to the ground. So here we find the tone of his writing as not favorable towards Sultan Mahmud. He not glorified this act of Sultan Mahmud. He just recorded the fact which he find in the later. Then after the expedition, after the conquest of Kannauj, his works ended. But in the end, he recorded the construction of Jame Masjid at Ghazni, which Sultan Mahmud did after returned back from the conquest of Mathura and Kannauj. And he would be record that Sultan Mahmud carried on the trees from Hind and Sindh to use the wood in this mosque. And also the Sangemarmar, marble from the faraway places. He not mentioned the name of the place here, like that of the trees of Hind and Sindh, but in my opinion, it was from Rajasthan region. So again, he, in the last portion of his work, he in the way praised the skilled masonry or labor of the Indians, as well as the use of Indian materials in the Jame Mosque built at Ghazni by Sultan Mahmud. So now he ended his work. Contemporary to Utbi was Al-Biruni, as I have said. He lived in India by that time, and by the time of 1020, when Utbi ended his work, he was very much here and lived for a decade till 1030. In India, as I have said, he learned Sanskrit, and on the basis of the Sanskrit sources and the conversation with the Indian learned people, he left his work, Tahqiq Mal-il Hind, better known as Kitabul Hind, and in Soka's terminology, Al-Biruni's India. He compiled this work in 1030 after the death of Sultan Mahmud, and when he returned back to Ghazni, so he published his work from Ghazni. So, as a scholar, as I have said earlier, as a scholar, Al-Biruni ignored the dynastic history of the Ghaznavites. He never wrote any historical works. But in Tahqiq Mal-il Hind, he mentions so many references here and there when he deals with the geography, when he deals with the towns and the ethnic groups and the itinerary of the regions, and sometimes very purportedly the reference of the dynastic history. So just opposed to the Utbi, Al-Biruni was very much sympathetic to the Hindu Shahiya rulers. He liked the Hindu Shahiya rulers. He wrote in detail the origin of the Hindu Shahiya, whose Wazir Kallar, who was a Brahmin, overthrew the early Turkish Shahi ruler of Kabul and established their rule. And in course of time, 3 rulers who were the contemporary to Sultan Mahmud, so obviously the contemporary of Al-Biruni, and those were the Jaipal, Anandapal, and Tilochanpal. So here he shows his sympathy towards the Hindu Shahiya rulers. And he wrote that, he records that Sultan Mahmud utterly ruined the prosperity of India from economic point of view, prosperity of India, and performed their wonderful exploits by which the Hindus became like atom of dust scattered in all directions. So here, by wonderful exploit, meaning why Utbi admit that Sultan Mahmud was very able commander of the age. But he ruined the prosperity of India. So through his expeditions, it was not only ruined the treasure, it was not only connected the treasures of the royal houses and the vault, they emptied the vault of the temples, but also disturbed the mass, the general people during his expedition, because in each year, in every year, Sultan Mahmud used to come in India. And the second year, he used to lead expedition in Central Asia. So here, Al-Biruni was very much sympathetic with the Indian people and mentioned that he ruined the prosperity of India. And by saying that Hindus scattered to all directions, he further added that so that since the expeditions were led every year, and that is why the Indian sciences also transported, also fled from Punjab and Sindh and established their higher learned seats at Kashmir and Banaras. So, and again, Al-Biruni mentions that these exploits and these expeditions led by Sultan Mahmud rose antagonism between Indian and the foreigners in concern of both from political as well as religious sources. So it was political because Sultan Mahmud defeated all the rulers, and it was religious because the Hindus became the prey at the hand of Sultan Mahmud expedition. So apart from this, Sultan Al-Biruni also mentioned the rise and falls of Carmathians. And he was the one who mentions that the Jalam bin Shaban was the originator of the Carmathians' rule in Multan. And he called Jalam bin Shaban as usurper. He usurped the dynasty from the Arab governors and established his rule. And then he mentions that when Jalam bin Shaban established his authority, his rule in Multan, he destroyed the old temple which was left as it is by Muhammad bin Qasim in 8th century AD. He not only destroyed the temple, but he killed the priests of that temple. And the Jalam bin Shaban also destroyed the Jami mosque made by Muhammad bin Qasim at Multan. So when Sultan Mahmud attacked Multan, in first times he made treaty, but in second times he overthrew and captured Abul Fatah Nasir, the ruler of that time, his contemporary ruler, Carmathians ruler. And now Sultan Mahmud opened the old mosque and closed the mosque of the Carmathian, which was built by the Carmathians. So also we find the reference of Somnath, very important in Al-Biruni's account. He mentions two dates very, very important. One date of the establishment of power and dethronement and decay of the Hindu Shahya in 1021. And the second date is the expedition against the Somnath in 1025. But he didn't mention any historical aspects of these expeditions in Ava. But he records that why this Somnath is so venerated. And his take is economic again. He records that Somnath is situated on the harbor of seafaring people and a station for those who were sailing between Africa and China. So it was one of the cause of the prosperity of this temple, because not only the people, and for this he mentions that the temple authority, the priest of that temples, collected a jug of Ganges water and a basket of Kashmir flowers daily for the use of this temple. So these hype attracted the people from all sides of India. They came and offered the money and the cash and kind. But in Al-Bairuni's view, it was also very much prosperous because the sailors stationed at Somnath. So here lies the very important point from economy and the prosperity of the temple, why this temple was so prosperous and which attracted the attention of Sultan Mahmud. So after these two Arabic world, by the first half of the 11th century, the Ghaznavid scholars began to write in Persian. And he followed that the state language was all earlier established as Persian on the basis of their overlord Samanids, because Samanids were very much Persian in their court etiquettes and their writings. So here again we find two important scholars, one Gardesi, who is a historian, who was attached with the court. He left Zainul Akhbar and he dedicated his work to Abdul Rashid, whose title was Zainul Millah, and that is why he named it as Zainul Akhbar. And he supplemented the work of Utbi. Utbi left its work in 1020, but it carried on from earlier time, from the time of Sabuktigin till the time of Sultan Masood and Maudud. So in this work again we find the account of expeditions, or all the expeditions of Sultan Mahmud. But here we find two very important points, that like Utbi, at one point Gardesi is also highlighted the liking of Sultan Mahmud toward the Indian elephants. So it was not only the Indian temples or the royal treasures which attracted the attention of Sultan Mahmud. Rather, it was the Indian war machine elephants, which from very beginning, from the time of Sabuktigin, was a basis of the collection of tributes from the Indian chiefs. So he mentions that the ruler of Sharwa, Mahmud known that the ruler of Sharwa, Ulchandar, having a very good breed of war elephants, and he wanted that. And when he attacked Sharwa, he found that elephants in a barren area, and he carried them. And so that he named that elephant as Khudadat, God gift. And again, Utbi mentioned this story also, this anecdote also, and he termed the name of this elephant as Khuda Avud, again the God gifts. And then Gardesi mentions that in one of the expeditions against the ruler of Kalinjar, when second time Sultan Mahmud knocked the door of against the Ganda, ruler of Kalinjar, in a very furious way, at that time Ganda sent his verses written in Hindi. It is the term Hindvi It is not the Hindvi of the 13th century's Khosrow's time. It is, in my opinion, it is the Hindui, the Indian language, in Indian language, meaning by it was written in Sanskrit. And Sultan Mahmud having the learned Indian Pandit or Indian scholars along with him. So when they transcribed, they explained the verses written by Ganda, Sultan Mahmud was so much impressed. And he not only left the Kalinjar and seized the siege of this fortress, but also he offered the 15 forts to Ganda for his administration, for his further administrations. So it was the liking of Sultan Mahmud toward the poetic verses which was written by Ganda in Indian language. And second scholar was again very prolific scholars. He was Bayhaqi. He left so many works, but one work known as Mujalladat was of in 30 volumes, but only 4 volumes come to us, 6, 7, 8, and part of 7, 8, 9, and part of 6th and part of 10th, which is now known as Tariq-e-Bayhaqi, published from Iran. So in his Tariq-e-Bayhaqi is a mine of information, because Bayhaqi was the Wazir of that region. And he served the 9 sultans of the Ghaznavid dynasty. So he had the documents, being a Wazir, he had documents from all the provinces of his period. So his work mentions 2 or 3 very important anecdotes. And one was the rise of Tilak, the Indian, as Nadeem had said earlier, who belonged to a very humble origin. He was a son of Hajjam, barber, came from Kashmir, but he was very learned man. He known everything in calligraphy and Jadui and Tantris. And soon, when he entered in the service of Sultan Mahmud in civil service as an Amil, the tax collector in Punjab region, he soon learned Sanskrit. And then he shifted to Ghazni. And by the time of Sultan Masood, he became the Salar and Sipah Salar of the Hindu contingent. So in both the work of Gardezi and Bayhaqi, we find the mention of the rise of Hindu Sipah Salars, Hindu soldiers, as a Salari Hindwan and the Sipah Salari Hindwan. And in both the works, we find the separate Indian contingent made by Sultan Mahmud, which we find in Nizamul Mulk Siyasatnama as well as in Vashamgir Qabusnama, that Sultan Mahmud had a very strong Indian contingent in his hand, very parallel to that of the Turkish contingent. And he used to Turkish contingents in Indian expeditions and Indian contingents against the Central Asian expedition. So in both these works, we find the name of the Salar, like that of Sondrai, the Nath, the Ba, and the Tilak. But Bayhaqi wrote in detail, in pages and pages, about the Tilaks, from his early life to his end. And he, both Gardezi and Bayhaqi, mentions that he was so much relied by Sultan Masood that when the Turkish commander of India, Ahmad Inal-Taghin, revolted in Punjab, Sultan Masood sent Tilak to separate this rebellion. And he did successfully. And in the very beginning, he captured the people who supported the Turkish soldiers, who supported the cause of Ahmadin al-Taghin, and ordered to cut their left hands, very much in the Indian fashion. It was the Indian law, as we come across in the Gupta period and other, that a rebellion was mutilated by their hand. So he utilized these harsh punishment on the Turkish soldiers, and Sultan Mahmud was behind him. He supported him. And then, with the support of the Jats of Sindh, he not only defeated Ahmadin al-Taghin, rather he chopped off the head of Sultan Ahmadin al-Taghin, which he offered to Sultan in front of Sultan Masud. And again, we find the account of the rebellious attitude of the Jats of Sindh. It is very curious again, because all the writers, Muhammad Habib as well as Muhammad Nazim, mentioned these expeditions as punitive expeditions against the Jats. But in my opinion, it is very important. Important in the sense that this expedition was fought, it was a naval battle, fought on the river Indus. And again that, the Jats having no territorial extent, no boundary, no kingdom, no kings, only the chiefs. They were living in the desert regions as well as in the rivers area. So it was very much daring steps of the Indian sides that an Indian ethnic groups dared to challenge Sultan Mahmud in the very end of his life. By that time, he was much popular, not only in India, but in Iraq and Iran also. So it was a very much daring steps of the Indian ethnic groups, the Jats. We find a very detailed account in Gardezi as well as in supporting accounts in Bayhaqi against these expeditions against the Jats and the naval battle which was fought on the river Indus. And very importantly, it was the last Indian expedition of Sultan Mahmud. So we find much similarity in the works of Gardezi as well as Bayhaqi. Here we find the presence of rebellious ethnic groups, Jats of Sindh and their separations, entry of Hindus in civil as well as military services, and rise of Hindu soldiers as Salar and Sipah Salar Hindwan, and the formation of elephant corps on the basis of the elephants which Sultan Mahmud, right from the time of his father Sabuktigin, collected from the India's regions, and he utilized again, like the Indian soldiers, he utilized these elephants in the expeditions against the Central Asians. He utilized these elephants against Khalaf of Sistan and the Illa Khan of Samarkand. So it was both. Both the authors mentioned this formation of elephant corps, and finally the separation of the rebellious Turkish commanders, the Aryaruk, and then Asif Taqin, and then finally the Ahmadin al-Taghin. And again, in my opinion, when we go through the sources of the Ghaznavids, we find that after that, we don't have the prose writing about the contemporary prose writers of the Ghaznavid period. So we find this tone of writing in all the poetic divans, all the poets of the Ghaznavid periods, having their interest in Indian elephants, in Indian expeditions, Indian topography, Indian salars and commanders, and the others. So, by this time, and again, the Baihaqis is a mine of informations of administrative system which Sultan Mahmud set up in India, and it was supplemented by the Indian poets Masood Shah Salman in toto. We find every offices, every divans, which Baihaqi mentions in 11th century, Masood Shah Salman mentions in the last year of the 11th and the early years of the 12th century AD in the Punjab regions. So it was joining these two sources, we have the sufficient material for the administrative systems of the Ghaznavids in India. And this administration became the legacy of the Ghaznavids for the Delhi Sultans. This administrative system transferred from Lahore to Delhi in course of time in 13th century. So it is very important. Apart from these four sources, we find one hagiographical work, Kashf al-Mahjub, written by Ali Hujweri, who died in 1077. His work, he was the second Sufi who entered into Punjab. In his work, we find very little information in Kashf al-Mahjub regarding the India, except that before him, it was Hussain Zanjani, a Sufi of the Junaid Baghdadi's order, was very much there in Lahore. And then he again was the follower of Junaid Baghdadi's sects. He left his account. So it was, the Kashf al-Mahjub was the first prose writing about the Sufis in Persian in Lahore. So it is the importance of this work. And again, we find the reference by going through the whole of the Kashf al-Mahjub, we find that Ali Usman Hujweri was not very much happy in India, because by that time, there was no environment of Sufi culture in Punjab. So he was the last. Again, after that, we find a different genre, from prose to poetic. And we all know that Sultan Mahmud nurtured a long retinue of the poets in his court. But among them, two were very important, Unsri as well as Farrukhi. And both, unlike Gardezi and Utbi, both Unsri and Farrukhi accompanied Sultan Mahmud in all his Indian expedition. And that is why we find the detailed account, the route of Sultan Mahmud Kannauj expedition in Unsri Diwan and Sultan Mahmud's Somnath expedition in Farrukhi's Diwan. We also find the reference of the geography and topography and the ethnic anecdotes of the Punjab. We find the reference of Jats in Unsri and these confrontations with the Sultan Mahmud. And both these poets again emphasized much upon the Indian elephants. And Farrukhi lived. In Farrukhi, we find so many qasidas in praise of Indian elephants. And he mentions that, both mention that in Shah Bahar, in Afghanistan, in Arzga, Sultan Mahmud collected 1,700 elephants, which Utbi also mentions. And Farrukhi and Unsuri both mention this. They tally these numbers. And one step ahead, Farrukhi named the elephant of Sultan Mahmud, liked by Sultan Mahmud, the personal elephants of Sultan Mahmud, who all were named, and again, they were named on the Indian. So all the Farrukhi divans was full of the name of the elephants in fashions of Indian culture and Indian customs, which Sultan Mahmud followed. And then in these divans, we also find the reference about the wazirs, the commanders, because we find qasidas in praise of them also. So we find the administrative system. So Unsuri and Farrukhi deals with the reign of Sultan Mahmud, while Menuchehri deals with the reign of Sultan Masood. But Menuchehri's divan lacks any historical information. It was just a poetical work compiled during the time of Sultan Masood, and it was very much different from the divan of Farrukhi and Unsuri. Then we find two very important poets of Indian origin. By that time, the people from the part of Khorasan and Iran migrated to India and settled in India. So Abul Farj Runi, born in the region of Sindh at a place Runa, and he was the first poets, important poets of India, who left his divan. And in both these, the Abul Farj Runi's and Masood Saad Salman's divan, we find the reign right from the time of Sultan Ibrahim to his successors and his two sons as governors. So a very important information we find in Abul Farj Runi. He was the first Indian author who mentions the institution of Iqta in Punjab region. And again, on the line of the 13th century work, Siyasatnama, he was very much against the Muqtas, high-handedness of Muqtas. And he wrote about the haughtiness of the Muqtas, which we find the curbing attitude in Siyasatnama of Nizam al-Mulk Tusi, who formed the laws related with the Muqta, how the Muqta behave, because by that time, the Muqta behaving very differently. So here we find the Iqta system in Indian administrative system, as well as the behavior of the Muqtas. And in Masood Saad Salman, who was very much prominent ruler, prominent poet, and who was the Shagird of Abul Farj Runi, he was very much contemporary to Abul Farj Runi and witnessed the reign of 5 Ghaznavid sultans. He died in 1121 in 12th century. His divan again is a mines of information, as I've said, and he himself was the official at Jalandhar. And he left an account of the expeditions of the son of Sultan Ibrahim to Agra, and in route and the topography from Lahore to Agra. So it was the new expeditions, which was enlisted in Masood Salman's and Abul Farj Runi's divan. And from poetic point of view, Masood Saad Salman is very much important, because the 13th century writer Safi in his Lubabul Albab mentioned that he left 3 divans in 3 languages: Arabic, Persians, and Hindi, the mixed language. And even Amir Khusro in 13th century, in his Dibacha-e Ghurratul Kamal, mentions that before me, it was Masood Shah Salman who left 3 divans in 3 languages, but I left so many divans in these 3 languages. And we find here and there the Indian language like that of the Indian war cry, Mar Mar, in Attack Attack in Sultan Masood's work. And from political point of view, Abdul Aziz said that if it was Sultan Masood, it was Masood Shah Salman who, having both the way of writings, the Khurasanian's approach, as well as the state Indian intellectualized style of poetic way. Since he was bold enough, I think so, and that is why he has spent his much life in prison. So his Hubs poem, prison poem, is very important. And again, he was the one who left the Ashok poetry. He left the Ashok poetry. It was again the poetry of lamentations. He initiated this poetry as Shahr-e Ashok. Shahr-e Ashok, he lamented the loneliness of Lahore, his birthplace, where he born. He came, his father came from Hamdan, but he born in India at Lahore. So in these Shahr-e Ashok, in Ashok poetry, he mentions all the aspects of the urban, as the urban centers of Lahore. All the officials, the peoples, and the other things. So we find the urban icons, we can say boldly that the urban icons in the poetical work of Masood Shah Salman. By the reign of Bahram Shah, who died in 1152, we find again a range of poets who were living in Ghazna. Prominent among them was Sanai. He left 3 works, Diwan, and a poetical works, Hadiqatul Haqiqa, and Maktubat. And again, in this, we find the mines of informations related with the governors, the Sipasalars, their rebellious attitudes in India, especially the rebellions of Bahalim and Shaibani Khan, as well as the administrative systems of India and the ethnic presence of the Indian dominion, in the Indian dominion. Contemporary to Sanai were the 3 more poets. One was Usman Mukhtari, and second was Sayyid Ashraf Hasan Ghaznavi, and third was Abdul Wasi Wahab al-Jabali, who left their divans. It is very important to point out that their divans are so much important that Ghulam Mustafa construct the history of Bahram Shah only on the basis of the divan of Sayyid Ashraf Hasan Ghaznavi. So it speaks itself, the importance of the divans which were written during the time of the last or the later Ghaznavid rulers. And after that, we don't have any divans. But the name of the poets in Lubabul Albab, Office Lubabul Albab, and some of the poets transferred their nobility or loyalty from Ghaznavites to the Ghurids when Muizzuddin bin Sam captured Lahore after defeating the last ruler Khosrow Malik in 1186. So we find the reference of poets but having no divans. So all these works of prose and poetry has been supplemented by three very, very important works of 13th century. One was by Fakhr Mudabbir, Adabul Harb wa Shuja, who was very much contemporary to the Ghaznavites. And during the time of the Ghaz invasions, the Ghaz incursions, he migrated to India from Ghazni and resided in Delhi and write this work, Adabul Harb wa Shuja, a very, very technical work on war crafts in India. In his work, we find the anecdotes related with the Ghaznavites also, and some are very important. One is dealing with the routes from Multan to Ghazni via Mukran and crossing the desert. And in the other anecdotes, we find the industry, steel industries, or making of the Indian swords in the suburb of Multan, and so on and so on. And the second author was Aufi. I'm not going in detail of all the anecdotes of Fakhr Mudabbir, and especially Fakhr Mudabbir mentions the favorite equipments, the favorite awzar of all the Ghaznavid rulers. Like that, the Indian mace was very much favorite to Sultan Masood. So it is very important. So then Aufi left two works. One is Lubabul Albab, who dedicated to Qabacha, and second is Jawamiul Hikayat wa Lawamiul Riwayat, who dedicated to the Wazir of Iltutmish. But in Jawamiul Hikayat wa Lawamiul Riwayat, although it is a work on moral, ethics, etiquettes, manners, and other, but we find so many anecdotes related with the Muslim dynasties of Iran and Central Asia. But among all these dynasties, we find much anecdotes related with the Ghaznavites, right from the time of Al-Taghin up to the last ruler, Khosrow Malik. Near about, we come across this manuscript. It's still in manuscript form in Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which is the very original and very earlier written manuscripts preserved in that library. So in that work, we find so many anecdotes related with the Ghaznavites. One anecdote is very important here. Nadim, sorry, we find that poor time. One anecdote is very important related with the Somnath. He mentions a very scientific thing of the Somnath idol. That he writes that when Sultan Mahmud knocked the door, opened the door of Somnath temple and entered into the sanctum sanctorum, he found that the linga was suspended in the air, in the middle of the house. Sultan Mahmud was astonished. He called the learned people, that how it was. And the people said that it was on the basis of the magnet system that it's suspended in the middle. So you damaged one wall, this idol automatically come down, and it was the same. So again, it gave impression that through these suspensions of idols in the air, the priests of the Somnath temple attracted the attentions of the masses of Indian people. So the third work is again very important, written in 13th century, is the work of Minhaj Siraj Tabqat-e-Nasri. He was again the contemporary of both the Ghaznavites and the Ghurids. And so we find the anecdotes, very important anecdotes related with the last part of the confront between the Ghaznavites and the Ghurid sultans. And he very explicitly mentions the support of the Indian ethnic groups, Khokhars, to the Ghaznavites ruler Khosrow Malik, and also the entry of the Indians in the Indian administrative system. So after that, we find in Sanskrit a very few works. Only work is the Raj Tarangani of Kalhan, written in 1150, and having no detailed information, only that the last Hindu Shahia rulers of Tirochan Pal and his conflict with Sultan Mahmud. Then Sultan Mahmud himself left the small legend which Nadim has dealt in detail on the coins. And we also find few Sanskrit inscriptions of 11th and 12th century, which was collected by Ram Gopal Misra in his work Indian Resistance to Early Muslim Invaders. And here we find not the hostility against the Ghaznavites. We find the term Trushka, not the Mleksha. The Trushka done. And in Kannauj inscriptions, we find the colony of the Ghazis mentioned as the Ghazipur. So by this, I ended. I taken so many time, I think so, Nadim. So I conclude the work that I came to the conclusion that actually in all this scenario, one thing was which the Bosworth and Nazim missed is the entry of North Indian people in the administrative and military system of the Ghaznavites, as well as the entry of Indian war machine elephants in the tactical warfare of the Ghaznavites. So it was the formation, these supports the North Indian people and the North Indian animal supports the formation of the Ghaznavid states, not only in India, but also in Ghazni too. Thank you, Nadim, very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Syed Jabir Raza Saab. It was a very illuminating lecture. And I hope that if some students are listening to it, they will find it very beneficial. Jabir Saab, can we take some questions? There are a number of questions which I can see. One of the first questions which has been asked is by Rohma Javed Rashid from Jamia, if I'm not wrong. She asks a question, as you can see probably. It has been argued that Udbi and Gardezi construct different narratives of the Muslim invasion of India, right? What difference do you find that in the two texts? Probably you did try to answer, but if you can, she asked this question before you started, in fact, dealing with this issue. But if you can further elaborate on this.
So, as I have said earlier, that Utbi in all his early expeditions and highlighted all the Sultan Mahmud's early expeditions in terms of religions, the victory of religions. As we said that in India, he found the conflicts of not only between the two rulers, rather it was the conflict between the followers of two religions. But in work of Gardezi, we don't find these rigidity. And the Gardezi was the first who started mentions the name of the Hindu soldiers, Hindu commanders. And he also, as I have said, that he mentions the expeditions of Tilak against the rebellious Turkish commander Samadin al-Taghin. So the one thing is common in both the places. Utbi was also very much attached with the Indian elephants, and the Gardesi too. But Gardesi was more elaborate in having the say of Indian commanders, not in India only, in the part of the Central Asian Ghaznavid dominion. So here lies the difference between the two authors.
Well, Dr. Ali Kazim has a number of questions. The first one is that at a time when Al-Biruni was writing in Arabic, he says that there was a full-fledged movement known as Shohobia movement, which had gained ground in the Persianate world. What do you have to say regarding that?
No, but we don't have any reference of this movement in any of the Arabic work or the Persian works. Not even in the work of the Samanid period, Tarikh-e-Samani. Not in the work of the Seljuk period. So it was very much different, and we are nothing to do with in Indian context, because we don't have any connections of this movement, the Persian movements, towards the Indian continent or Indians' dominions of the Ghaznavites period. I'm dealing with the sources of the Ghaznavites related with the India and Central Asia.
Well, there is a
so
question.
We don't have.
Right. There is another question by him, and this one is related to India. He says that Al-Biruni does mention the persecution of the Karmathians. Yeah, is he? He asks, sympathetic to the Hindu Shahis?
Yes. No, Al-Biruni didn't mention the persecutions which we find in Fakhr Mudabbis Adabul Harb Shuja, not in Utbi and not in Gardesi. But he mentions that Jalam bin Sheba was the original man who usurped the authority of the Arab governors of Multan and established his own territory, his own dynasty. And he only mentioned that Sultan Mahmud defeated him and imprisoned him, the Abul Fatah, which was the contemporary ruler of Sultan Mahmud, and sent him to Ghazni in prison. And he was very much sympathetic towards the Hindu Shahya ruler. As I said that, he himself wrote that the road which was constructed by Sabuktagin, Sultan Mahmud, crossed these roads into India, entered into Punjab, and utterly ruined the prosperity of India, as well as by his wonderful expeditions, exploits, the Hindus became the atom of dust and scattered in all directions. Here, Hindu, not only the masses, Hindu, the Hindu Shahya. And Al-Biruni was the first man, the first writer who called these dynasty as Hindu Shahya dynasty. And he was very much sympathetic because he liked Jaipal, Alandapal, who was the very learned man and whose teacher wrote a grammar book which was very much popular in Kashmir. Earlier it was not popular, but Jaipal sent money to popularize the work of his teachers in Kashmir. So he was very much sympathetic in all the way. He was not against the Hindu Shahya and not even supported the Sultan Mahmud in any way.
Well, there's a question by Mehru Jafar. Probably Mehru Jafar is from Lucknow. I've seen her work and she's very active. She asks a very hypothetical question, but a very interesting question at that. If the people of Turkic, Mongol, Persian, Arab, and Afghan who had settled in South Asia had dissolved into the Indic way of life, giving up Islam, would tensions between populations following different faiths have been more harmonious today?
But it is hard to say, because when the Indians migrated to Ghazni and settled in different parts of Central Asia as Mahabat or as Indian soldiers during the time of Sultan Mahmud or Sultan Masood or the Ghaznavids, they didn't left or forgo their religion to assimilate in the culture, the Ghaznavids' culture. He followed the Ghaznavid culture. He followed the Ghaznavids' court culture. He introduced their own cultures also, as the beating of the drums on the gate of the sultans, on the nobles, and the others. But he never deserted their own religion in Central Asia. Like that, we find that the Jews and Magas, Parsis, were living in India, as Al-Biruni mentions. But they followed their own religion, their own path, their own way. So it is very difficult to say that the peoples who came from Central Asia, from Iran, from Khorasan, or from Afghanistan, and who settled in India, in the part of Punjab first, and then in Delhi and the other parts, lived their religions. Because religion is not matter, the culture is matter. Whether they adopted the culture of the time or not. In my view, it is important that how they cultivated the culture of the time. So it is very important. Like that, Sultan Mahmud appreciated the verses written in Sanskrit. It was written in Sanskrit. So he rejected that. He would have rejected that, but he didn't. So it was the adoption of the Indian way, adoption of the Indian culture, adoption of the Indian language, impressed by the Indian language, impressed by the poetic way of the Indian rulers. So it was, to my mind, not religion, it was the culture which matters most for the adaptations in different way, in different time. The culture of India is very much different in Ghaznavid period in Punjab, and it is different in Delhi Sultanate, and it is much different in the Mughal time. So,
well, a related question, you are correct. A related question which Behru Jafar is asking, which is there on your screen, what difference did these Sufis make? Were they an asset or were they an hindrance to the Muslim conquest? The Sufis.
What repeat is?
Were Sufis arriving into South Asia also in the 12th century considered an asset or hindrance by Muslim conquerors settled here around the same time? So, क्या जो role था Sufis, how were they taken?
It is in 12th century we find only the two prominent Sufis, Hussain Zanjani and the Ali Uthman Hujweri. So here we don't find in detail that the Kashful Mahjoob is full of the Sufistic anecdotes related with the earlier Sufis of Central Asia and Iran, Iraq, like that of Hassan Basri, Ibrahim bin Adham, and Junaid Baghdadi. Most of the anecdotes round about the Junaid Baghdadi, because Usmani Hujweri himself belonged to that order. So, but we don't find any, I don't find much reference related with the society and culture of Lahore. But we find that in one place he said that he was not comfortable in Lahore. He write that Darmiyan na jinsa giraftar shuda budam. He was imprisoned in between the uncongenial atmosphere. So it means that by that time in 12th century, at least in Punjab and Sindh, there was no Sufistic movement, no Sufis who having their say to popularize the religion or their way or their orders in India, in South Asia. I don't know the other places, but I don't have any reference of the other places because Hussain Danjani was the first Sufi who entered into the South Asia in India, followed by the prominent Usman Hujweri. He was the much prominent till the time of the arrival of Moinuddin Chishti. When Moinuddin Chishti came, the Chishtiya orders established at Ajmer was very much different from that order. So during 12th century, we don't have any.
There are a number of questions related with the elephants. For example, Kazim asks whether these same elephants which you talked about, which were in the army, were they an undoing as far as Masood is concerned? Because he points out that in 1040, in Danda Khan, the war, he was defeated due to the elephants.
Yes. In one of my article, I have dealt in detail this system which Kazim want to know. That the Ghaznavids, we find the 3 stages of the Ghaznavide attention towards the elephants. In one stage, during the time of Sabuktigin and Sultan Mahmud, they tried to tame the elephants, tried to capture the Indian elephants, and having overpowered the Indian elephants. And then in second stage, in tactical move, they used the elephants as a war machine. And for that matter, for the taming of the elephant, Sultan Mahmud used the archers, the sharpshooters, and the Arab governors. While for the using of the elephants, he using both the man, the Indian Mahawat, as well as Mahawat from Sistan, the Muslim Mahawat, as well as the Turkish Mahawat, as we find in the case of Gwalior, when the ruler of Gwalior sent open the elephants, the Mahabas captured that elephants and followed them to the camp. But he's right. Kazim is right. In the Battle of Dandan Khan, the Seljuki Turks were much offensive in the way the Sultan Mahmud was offensive in Indian territory against the elephants. They, having cut the trunks, cut the bellies, they demonstrated their sharpness, they were the sharpshooters, so they damaged the Sultan's elephants. So the Seljuki Turks doing the same way which Sultan Mahmud did earlier in the Indian dominion. So during the time of Sultan Masood, it was very much different. And again, it was very much difficult during the time of the Ghurids. The Ghurids again very much offensive. And they captured the Indian elephants, the Ghaznavids elephants. And by the time of the Khosrow Malik, the Ghaznavids had no elephants. The only elephants Muizuddin bin Sam collected from last ruler Khosrow Malik. So it was the 3 stages we find. One was the taming of the Indian elephants. Second was the using of the Indian elephants. And third was the losing of the Indian elephants in the tactical warfare.
Well, Kazim further asks you a very interesting question regarding the elephants. Do we overemphasize this, elephant business? Much more stress has been
overemphasized
by the historian.
It was underemphasized still, because the Indian elephants having their value. Bayhaqi records that its price was 1 lakh dirham in that time. So when it was so precious, elephants, And all the rulers of India having their ages on the basis of elephants, even the Porus against the Alexander. So all the time, even the Nandas and even the Mauryas. So we find the Indian custom that Indian rulers built much on the elephants. They added the elephant first. And so did the Hindu Shahya rulers. And when Sultan Mahmud and Sabuktagin, his father Sabuktagin, saw the havoc of these elephants, as we saw, we witnessed in the Qadsiya battle in Iraq, that the Persians used the elephant against the Arabs, and Arabs were very much terrified. So here we find the emphasis on elephant because we find emphasis of elephant in the works of the Ghaznavites, right from the time of the Utbis and even the Al-Biruni, and the much in Gardezis and in Bayhaqi, and much more in the poetical works. So my opinion that hitherto no work has been done on the Indian elephants vis-a-vis the Ghaznavites. I came up with this one of my articles on both. Both of my articles is very new. The formation of the Hindus and Hindu contingents in the Ghaznavites, as well as the use of the elephants in tactical warfare by the Ghaznavites, and collections of the elephants from the Indian soldiers and from the Indian chiefs as a tribute. Even the Indian chiefs presented the elephants to the sultans.
Professor Jabir Raza Sahab, thanks a lot for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
There are a number of other comments which I may please you afterwards when you treat me to tea. I mean, there are many positive comments coming on your lecture. I feel jealous. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
I started this study of on Sultan Mahmud naturally with the book of Muhammad Habib Sahab. It's one of the most impressive books which has been, as you rightly pointed out, it drew the attention of the scholars towards the Ghaznavites as such. It was the book with which, the so-called, Marxian approach to writing of medieval Indian history started, and one can say that was the Bunyad foundation stone of the Aligarh School of Historiography as it further developed. So my knowledge was naturally on Sultan Mahmud, based on that particular book. Thank you very much for adding over to it. My conviction has further grown that Sultan Mahmud was a conqueror, a very vicious person. Naturally, he was living much before the modern age, cruel too, but at least secular in his approach. The atrocities which he committed did not have
the demand of the time.
It was politics. It was more than politics. It was economy which was playing the role, as you rightly tried to point out, the economic importance of the places which he attacked and tried to loot. You also talked about how the sources of that period give us enough information for us to understand that even in those initial stages, when the initial conquest of India was taking place, there were attempts by the foreigners as well as Indians to understand each other. This is an aspect which somehow today we forget. जब आज हम बात करते हैं, जैसे when I started this, I said that there are 4 big personalities of medieval India, starting with Mahmud, going on to Firoz Shah Tughlaq, Then, of course, the two Mughals, Babur and Aurangzeb, who are supposed to be the villains of the Indian history. And that is why the attempt by the present day some politicians to claim that for 2000 years we have been, or 1000 years we have been enslaved. But as you rightly pointed out, that even during that period, I mean, the sources which you told, you did not tell us about the Indian point of view. You were telling about what the Ghaznavite sources themselves mention about the condition out here.
Yes.
और उसमें भी जैसे इसीलिए मैंने when I started there was, I mean, I did not need to, but I especially went to give details about that coin where they tried to project even their faith in the light of the faith of the Indians themselves, not emphasizing के Prophet Muhammad जो हैं वो रसूल हैं, but using the Indian term अवतारा जो यहाँ के ऊपर माना जाता था, बिल्कुल उस तरह से उसको पेश करने का excellent way of understanding what our common culture has been. So once again, I really thank you for this very, very illuminating lecture. It was the first of this series which we are going to have, and I think that it is around up till March that we have already planned the various lectures on this particular theme, the sources, and we have a great lineup of scholars. And you are fortunate enough that you are inaugurating this whole series of lectures. Viewers, let me also say that the Asha and Ganga Jamni are running two parallel programs. One on Fridays, जो आज हमने शुरू किया है on sources. We are continuing with the reflections on our shared past, and in that series on Sunday we would be having a very renowned scholar, and I would invite all of you to please be there. Professor Catherine Asher has agreed to talk to us, but there would be a slight change in our schedule. We usually hold our programs at 7 in the evening, but because of on the insistence of Catherine Asher, we have delayed it by around an hour or so. We will be starting that day at 8 or 8:30. I'm forgetting. I'll be putting up the posters, so we'll be starting a little late. But I hope that you keep supporting us. I would once again urge all of you who are watching to in fact subscribe to our channels, both Ganga Jamni as well as Asha, the Association of the History and Archaeology, which is an association of the historians from Aligarh, all those who are related with Aligarh. We hope that you keep on listening to us, and we keep on our basic aim, as all of you by now know, is कि जो information किताबों में बंद है, बहुत ही ज़्यादा एक तरीके से इस जबान में कि आम फहम लोग ना समझ पाए, हमारी कोशिश ये होगी आशा की और गंगा जमनी तहजीब की कि हम उस इंफॉर्मेशन को जो स्कॉलर्स की है, जो बड़ी बड़ी मोटी मोटी कॉम्प्लेक्स किताबों में जो उन्होंने बातें कही हैं, उसको हम आसान करके आपके सामने पेश करें ताकि आप उसको समझ सकें. Thank you very much for joining with us, and thank you, Professor Jabir Raza. When you saw the poster, Catherine Asher would be on Sunday, 8 p.m. in the evening. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you.